you are the hyphen, you are the bridge. And you go to all these places not because you are searching feverishly for something, which is what I was earlier, but you're going to various places because you're lucky at this point in your life that these places allow you to express different aspects of yourself that are still important to you.
Hello and welcome to Outlook Bibliofile. It is indeed a rare occasion to have a poet in our discussions, and that too Arundhathi Subramaniam, who's one of India's foremost poets, and it's a cause of celebration whenever a book of poetry comes out in India, in English particularly. Of course, in other languages there are a whole lot of poets writing. So you are one of the rare breeds, Arundhathi, who's writing in English poetry and coming out with new collections and very successfully so.
Yes, I think that decision was made a long time ago, Satish, the decision to write poetry. And it was not the most glamorous decision to make because books of poetry are not, certainly very seldom bestsellers. But, it's the old-fashioned love of an old-fashioned form. What can I say?
When does a poet realize that he or she is a poet? I mean, when did you start writing? Was it like very early in?
I started writing early, but I'm not sure I'd say that I recognized that I was a poet as much as I recognized that I enjoyed hanging around words and I enjoyed hanging around patterned language, which in a way is what a poem is. It's a particular kind of choreographed language, and that excited me. It excited me, I often say, in the way that dance excites me. Poetry is a particular kind of kinetic language. It's unpredictable, the way dance is. The ability of language to move from one place to the next without you ever knowing how it got there. That leap that a dancer is capable of making. In many ways, that to me is what poetry is, and it fascinated me as a child. And I think it does most people. It's just that I continued.
Yes. And this collection particularly, I mean, your previous few books have been, let's say, sort of more godly, more spiritual. I mean, this is more like everyday spirituality, it seems. I mean, they're very modern poems. I mean, they're poems about our times, our lives, even news, that is. I mean, a few poems do have the sort of politics and the news of the day. And so, so this is a bit of a different approach. I mean, a different set of poems from what you've been doing in the last few years.
It's different, Satish, but on the other hand, none of my poems, I mean, I'm talking about my earlier collections, this is the fifth, none of the collections have ever been about anything sacred in any conventional sense of the term. So it was with my last book, that is When God is a Traveler, that people started talking about the sacred in my poetry. Until then, it was actually themes that I would consider to be more existential, love, loss, quest, the city, gender politics, all of that. And in some way, I'd say that those themes remain. But what has perhaps changed in the new poems is treatment. I feel that the poems, I've said this before, and I feel that that is perhaps the truest way I can describe it. The poems breathe differently on the page. They're much more perforated, they're much more ridden with holes, in a way.
In fact, I would say, after reading, you over the years, this is, there is a certain mellowness, is it? I mean, I don't know if it is to do with also, your experience in life. I mean, that one raw edge, it seems to be kind of slightly ironed out, and they're like quite polished, and there's a confidence in. I mean, these are few things that I thought, and also, as I was just saying, very, very sort of our lives today.
Yes, I mean, our lives today is always what interests me. I mean, the way in which I experience my life at this moment. That's the basic logic of a lyric poem, I think. You're trying to distill a particular moment and the truth of that moment. But in response to what you said about mellowness, I'd say I see what you're saying, in that I feel that this book is more, there's a greater sense of equipoise in a way about this.
Sure, that is, I mean, that's probably the word I wouldn't have got it. Yes, the mellow is not the word.
No, mellow is not a bad word at all, except that I think it sometimes suggests to people an absence of intensity.
Yeah, as if the sting is gone.
The sting is
that
gone.
is not what I meant. Yeah.
Yes, so for me, the intensity alongside a certain subtlety, that for me is the combination that I would aspire to.
You know, I know once you told me that you know, the place that where you belong. You said actually you have, say, 3 homes. You know, one your home in Bombay, and then at the Isha Foundation with Sadhguru. We'll come to that a little bit. Her connection with that, and of course your house in New York where you live with your partner. So, and in the poems one can make out this one. You know, there is almost all the poems have this belonging in some way. Whether, as you said, I think in the word you use unrenting, as opposed to unbelonging.
Untenanting.
Untenanting, yeah. You know,
untenanting.
So is this you know, this so which is your place? I mean, which is
Such
your home?
Such a good question, and I wish I knew how to answer that. It's been the question of much of my life, but I will say this. I think there was a time when this sense of not belonging, which was very acute for me at one point in my life, in my early years, my 20s, my 30s, it was almost a double life, I feel now, looking back. You know, there was one area where one was competent and productive, and there was another area of parallel quest, because the sense of unbelonging was intensifying in a sense. And I wasn't quite sure how to address that. But let me address it through poems, because I felt this was a shift that happened in my last book, and it's in some ways cemented here. Perhaps this is true for many of us, that we spend a lot of our time trying to heal this or make sense of a very fragmented, piecemeal inheritance. You know, we think we come from somewhere, but we're thrown somewhere else. We speak one language, but we're surrounded by others. You know, the wonderful, rich, crazy experience of being Indian too.
Yeah.
So I think up to a point in my life, a lot of that seemed like something one had to grapple with and sort out, and I felt conflicted in many ways. The feeling that I was never a round peg in a round hole, and other people were, you know, this sort of crazy idea. Until you realize, and it took me time to realize, that I could celebrate these differences. You know, this crazy fragmented inheritance was something to feel good about. And for me, in the poems, that healing happened when I finally realized, through one of the archetypes that I talk about in the previous book, Shakuntala, I realized that there is this woman trying to make sense of the varied aspects of her life, never quite belonging either to city or hermitage or to earth or sky. We don't know where she comes from, really. She has parents who come from both places. So I thought of her as a kind of genetic calamity, you know, a recipe for disaster. And it was towards the end of the poem cycle that something shifted for me personally. And I began to see her no longer as this woman who's constantly looking for the place where she belongs. Instead, I saw her as the bridge. She is the place where all these very diverse elements meet. That's how important she is. And in a way, I think that is just how important we are as human beings. We are the place where this extraordinary resolution can take place.
And you know, that's so, say your life at the Isha Foundation, you know, as we all know, Arundhathi has a close relationship with Sadhguru and the Isha Foundation, and your life in New York. I mean, it must be the diametrically sort of in so many ways a different life, isn't it? Would you like to tell us a little bit about your relationship with the Isha Foundation and you know, Sadhguru?
My connection has been with Sadhguru for various reasons. One is because I happened to write a biography, and that entailed spending time working very closely with material around Sadhguru, transcripts of his talks, conversations with him. But the other thing I'd say, which is perhaps even more primary, was my own spiritual journey, which led me, after much thrashing and flailing and floundering, it led me to him. And he's been the kind of guide that I think, now looking back, I think the kind of guide that makes the most sense to me. When I first heard him speak, it felt like he was someone who was capable of being very accessible, very secular in his mode of articulation, and yet someone who, for me, seemed to be a person who knew about the nuts and bolts of living and dying, which is what I was looking for by the time that I met him. So he started as a friend, and that has deepened, and I would certainly consider him to be my spiritual guide. So I think as my own journey deepened and took on a certain urgency, it also became necessary for me to spend longer spells of time in the ashram. And yet, through it all, Satish, I think I continued to be a traveler and continued that somewhat vagabond life. In fact, anything that also gathered momentum. And I wanted to know how it all made sense, until I began to figure that perhaps the only way it does make sense is the way that the Shakuntala metaphor allowed me to see. That is, you are the hyphen. You are the bridge. And you go to all these places not because you are searching feverishly for something, which is what I was earlier, but you're going to various places because you're lucky at this point in your life that these places allow you to express different aspects of yourself. Aspects of yourself that are still important to you.
That is, it's really a sort of a calming realization.
Yes.
In that some ways,
yes.
And that I suppose it comes across also in this collection.
Yes.
There's a lot of Bombay in the book.
That's my city.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's so beautifully evocative. Would you like to read a Bombay poem, or would you like to read any poem that? Because I have many favorites.
You do?
But the one I had was a little too long to read. But
I hope it is The Fine Art of Aging that was a favorite.
It's a beautiful poem.
Glad.
The Fine Art of Aging. It's like absolutely fantastic. But all of them
Maybe
are.
I will read you. Thank you, Satish. Maybe I'll read you the Bombay poem that actually starts the book.
Sure. Yeah.
Shall I do that?
Please. That would be wonderful.
Because this particular poem, which is called I Grew Up in an Age of Poets, is in many ways an acknowledgement of my time in Bombay, growing up in the city, and knowing that I was actually heir to a living tradition of poets, because that's a city of poets.
True.
And feeling very grateful for that, but also there's a wry quality. I think there's an irony in this poem because it uses a line from Eunice D'Souza, the poet, the Bombay poet, as an epigraph. She has a line in which she says, "Best to meet in poems." So I think this is true. Many of us have probably read poems and loved them, some poems, and then actually made the mistake of meeting the poet. And there is a great sense of anticlimax that can happen. But this is also, it's about a legacy of Anglophone poetry to which I was heir growing up in the city. And it's also a reflection on the kind of legacy one might want to leave behind.
Sure.
I grew up in an age of poets. I grew up in an age of poets who told me joy was for cabbages, until I found that beneath their smoking empires of sulphur, there lay a shiver of doubt, that they wondered, as I did, about what it might mean to be leafy, to wilt, to be damaged sometimes by upstart caterpillars, and still stay green, chaotically, wetly, powerfully green. Now, I meet poets who exchange visiting cards, are best friends with the dentist, all dankness deodorized, their poems cool seashells, their laughter splintered eggshells, poets who never seem to wonder about cabbages at all. Still best to meet in poems.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely super. Thank you so much. The other aspect, of course, is the sort of celebration of womanhood in the poems, and it's not it's in a very sort of light, sort of very casual, humorous way in many ways. That's another so I thought a remarkable thing about the books. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? Like say Avayar, for instance, the way you talk about her, this Tamil bhakti poet.
Yeah, well, yes, she's a Tamil mystic. Mystic. I mean, she's been seen in many ways. She's been seen as a poet. She's been seen as a wise woman.
As a
She's
crone.
As the crone, which is the figure that interests me more and more. So yes, I think there are women in this book, many women, and I hadn't quite realized it until the book came together. So that's when I began to realize the number of women, from Avayar, this wise old woman who fascinates me, because I think as I grow older, I grow more interested in the notion of the aging woman, and the fact that men, as they seem to grow older, have the option to turn into wise sages, but women, particularly in an age of youth and beauty, seem to have to turn into either hags or fluffy grandmas, but little else. So I think I began to grow more fascinated by the idea of the woman who ages and yet grows in power and strength and wisdom. That's Avayar. And I grew interested also in just the notion of, there's a poem called A Song to Catabolic Women, which is just an anthem to women in their 50s and above. I think there's a particular kind of freedom that many women experience as well as they grow older, which I wanted to acknowledge and explore. And there is the goddess. There is the goddess presence, and she beckons somewhat imperiously. So, that's the nature of the goddess, and she made her way in there as well. And there's a poem to my mother. So yes, and there are poems to women friends. So I began to realize that women populated the book, but there are others too. It's not, the tone of the book is actually one of wonder.
Yeah, true.
Much more one of wonder.
Yeah.
And that's been for me a certain part of a process of self-reclamation that I'm grateful for, because I felt I'd lost that sense of wonder over a period of time in my life. So to be able to reclaim that sense of being gobsmacked at everything around you, living, dying, all of it.
Before I leave you, you read so well. It's such a pleasure to listen to you read your poems. I know it's a very long poem, but if you could just read a little bit from The Art of Aging, since we just discussed how Avayar and how women after 50, this certain liberating sort of a feeling. But little bit, would you like to read?
Maybe,
from?
Sure.
I know it's otherwise it.
Okay. Let me read you a section of the Avayar poem. This is the moment when Avayar encounters Muruga, the little boy on the tree who offers her a fruit. And usually, conventionally in the myth, this is a story that's seen as Avayar's comeuppance. This is the moment when she realizes that she has a long way to go. In my poem, Avayar becomes the wise woman who sees this little boy as her friend. This boy god is her best friend. So what's it going to be, Gran? A hot fruit or a lukewarm one? Asks the little boy on the tree, left cheek bulging with jamun and laughter. Pure cheek, really. Avayar sighs, knows the tiresome games of the young, trick questions, riddles, puns, crosswords, wisecracks, bon mots, limericks, anagrams, knows the little boys grow into men that scintillate, men that pontificate, men that dribble curses, men that cannot apologize, grey-faced men, men that turn love to ash, men with shiny weapons and kettle drum agitations, men with epic stories, epic vanities, epic bibliographies, epic, men that make young girls giggle and silently plot vengeance, Vedantin men, men with restless gazes, men that sip white wine and drip malarme. Avayar sighs. The thing about age is seeing through the game, but being able to smile at those who play it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Arundhathi. Thank you very much for being in a Bibliophile. It's an honor, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Satish.
Thank you.